arrays. So we're talking about enhanced for loops today. So a brief recap of what we talked about last class. If we want to access every element within an array, we can use loops. We can have our index start at 0, while I is less than the length of our array, increase it by 1 each time, and then we can print the array at the current index. Which will loop over every single index in our array, and then we'll access the elements at that index each time. Now, question here is there a way to loop over our elements directly without having to reference the index? The answer is yes, there is. So we can use enhanced for loops, which are also referred to as for each loops, as an alternative method to using normal for loops or while loops that we've been using to traverse arrays. So if you're familiar with Python, you'll probably know this type of for loop already, where we're going to loop over the elements within a list rather than the indices within, in this case, it would be an array rather than a list. So these for each loops are going to offer a simpler syntax. They're simpler to write, but they have less flexibility than normal for loops, where you do the for I in range. How do they work? The answer, here we go. Here's how one is written out. So we've still got our for keyword. It's a type of for loop. And then in our parentheses, we have our iterator. And this is the variable that is going to store the current elements in your loop. So this is very similar to I in a regular for loop. And the type of your iterator is going to match the type of value being stored in the array. And then we have a colon, and on the right side of the colon we have the array we want to traverse or iterate over, where the iterator is going to have a value from the array each time through the loop. So if I wanted to actually write this with real code, let's say I have a scores array of ints. I'm going to have in my for loop, I'm going to have an int score, a single score. And of course it's int because the array is of ints. So we have our iterator is score in the array scores. So for each score in scores is essentially how we can read this kind of loop. We're going to print that score. So in this example, we would see score is going to equal 80. So we would print 80, and then score would equal 92. We would print 92. Then it would equal 91. Then it would equal 68. And then it would equal 88. So it's going to equal each of those values in turn, one after the other within our for loop. So this lets us access our elements directly without needing to access the indices, which can be pretty convenient. So they provide us with a simpler, cleaner way to loop over every element in a loop. If we do not care about indices, this is the easier way to loop over all the elements in an array. This is especially helpful when we're working with arrays filled with objects, because in a standard for loop, let's say I have a classroom array full of student objects. So these would each have been initialized before they were added to the array, but we have an array full of different student objects. In a standard for loop, if I wanted to get the name from every single student in my array, I would need to print my classroom array at index I dot get first name. I would need to do several layers of access, where in my for each loop, the syntax for my for loop is simpler, and I can just say from the current student that I'm looking at, because I'm looking at each student in my classroom. So I'm going to say for the current student, get their first name. So the syntax within my loop is also a bit simpler. I don't have to deal with accessing from a specific index here. So, reasons why we would want to use for each loops. They offer us a simplified structure, and they are especially good when we're using nested loops. As we have more and more nested loops, our programs are going to get more complex and harder to read. So if we have our simpler for loops, having easier to read things is always going to be better. And in general, for each loops are going to be easier to write than the alternative, than a regular for loop or a regular while loop. And why we might want to use a standard for loop instead. If we need to make use of the indices of the array inside of our loop, we are going to need to use a standard for loop, because the standard for loops iterator is going to reference those indices rather than the elements themselves. And since for each loops are making a copy of the element, they're not referencing the index whatsoever. They're not going to be optimal if you want to actually update values inside of the array. They're not going to let you make changes to the array if you wanted to. So if you want to update your array while you're looping, you're going to want to use a standard for loop or a while loop instead of an enhanced for loop or a for each loop. And there you have it. Any questions on how to use a for each loop in Java?
Mr. Macmillan?
Yes.
Does a for each loop also offer like performance benefits, or like internally is it the exact same thing as a for loop but just a simpler syntax?
I don't actually know the answer to that. I will look that up and get back to you as soon as people are working.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? All right, then I will stop our recording.